Hello and welcome to yet another video of my pointless desert sled mods. Today we will change the rear tire and while doing so turning the rear rim into a tubeless one. As our weekend rides have taken us deeper and deeper into the Scandinavian forests, I learned that I should probably do better with a more off-roady tire. So I'm gonna swap the original one, which is called Pirelli Scorpion Rally STR. I believe the STR stands for street, although these tires are quite capable off-road as well. I'm gonna swap to the sister model, which is called Pirelli Scorpion Rally. And nothing more, because it is more rally. And while at it, I'm also gonna turn the rear rim into a tubeless one, just like I did with the front rim, which by the way is holding up nicely still. There are many good videos on YouTube that will show you how to remove both front and rear wheel, but upon request I'm still going to show you here how to remove the rear wheel from the desert sled. First you will need some kind of paddock stand that will lift up the swing arm. These are super easy to find on the interweb and also in your local motorcycle store. The one I'm using is fitted with two rubberized L brackets that when lifted it supports the swing arm nicely. You also need a torque wrench, especially when you put the wheel back on. And you need two 30mm wrench sockets, or whatever you call them in English. Actually one is enough as long as you have a 30mm wrench on the other side. Once the axle nut is loose, I'd like to loosen up the chain tension quite a lot, because that makes it easier to refit the chain later in the process. You do this on both sides of the swing arm. With one axle nut removed, doesn't really matter which side, you use a rubber mallet to gently tap the axle through the wheel and it should pop out on the other side. Lift the wheel with one hand as you pull out the axle with your other hand, and the wheel will drop down to the floor. Always be careful with the brake, especially the disc, and once you get the wheel loose you can actually remove the whole brake unit and put it on the side. Now when the wheel is loose you can push it forward a bit to remove the chain and just gently leave it hanging there on the swing arm. And then you can simply just roll the wheel back out. Cowabunga! On the sprocket side of the wheel there's a spacer that you do not want to lose. It just falls out like that. Now you can easily remove the whole sprocket carrier as well. Just pull it out and then you will find there's yet another spacer on the inside that you want to keep safe as well. And then off to the local tire shop. They're very friendly and helpful and also professional, which helps. Of course you could do this yourself in the garage, but I'm not going to. I buy my tires from them and the mounting of the new tire is included. So now with the tire and tube gone, it's time to remove this protective rubber band, which will be replaced by this special sealing tape. But before that, I would like to go over the spokes and make sure that they are nice and tight, which you do with a 7mm wrench. And then of course you want to clean out thoroughly the surface area where the tape will attach. In this case I will also make sure that the depressions where the spokes are attached are super clean, because this time around I will fill out these depressions with silicone. I didn't do it on the front rim and I had to pay the price. You can see that in that video. And this time around I figured I would go all the way and use the silicone in order to minimize the potential air leakage, so I can use only one layer of tape. It will also level out the inside of the rim, preventing the tape from being depressed down into these small cups by the air pressure, and hopefully that will also help to keep the air inside. As I was waiting for the silicone to set, I used the time to change the handguards. For those of you who watched my first video about the Scrambler know that I'm not particularly impressed with the handguards from Evotech. They're simply not strong enough to handle a fall. Especially not this bit that attaches to the mount of the rear view mirrors and it just bends like nothing. So I replaced the expensive Evotech ones with some dirt cheap Barkbuster imitations. However, they didn't really allow the clutch lever to fit, so I had to cut off that little knob at the end, which is fine because I had a spare lever on the shelf. Now only the future will let us know if these dirt cheap ones are strong enough for me to drop the bike in the forest. But the fitting seems quite solid, and if they break, well, they're dirt cheap. A funny little side note is that in order to make them fit, I had to actually switch them around, so the right one is on the left-hand side and vice versa. But back to the rear wheel. Now when the silicone has set, it's time to fit the sealant tape. Now the tape is quite particular and it requires a bit of concentration. It's super sticky, so take your time and make sure that you level it out as much as possible. The tape has protective film, and once that's removed you work over the tape with both thumbs. So this is what it looks like when finished. There were some minute bubbles trapped underneath the tape that I tried to squeeze out, but I couldn't. And that's actually a good thing, because if I can't squeeze the air out, then hopefully no air can get underneath the tape either. Where the air valve sits, I put on a second layer of tape and then drilled a hole to fit this air valve for tubeless rims. When fitting this air valve, it's important to not tighten it too hard because you might squash the rubber seals. And back to the tire shop to fit the new tire. And once I got it on, I put it in a tub of water to investigate if there were any leaks. And guess what? Disappointed! Especially since I'd taken extra measure to fill in the cups with silicone. But when thinking back, I realized that I hadn't put any silicone actually in the spoke nuts. And this could explain why the air seemed to escape through the treads of that particular spoke nut, although I think the tape should have covered it. And back to the tire shop again. So now, as we can see, the air pressure from mounting the tire has depressed the tape much firmer onto the rim, and that has sealed up most of it except for that silly spoke nipple, which I highlighted with a piece of tape. So that makes this one, and you can see that it's possible that there's an air channel coming through there. Not sure. I think I'm going to open up a little hole there and inject silicone into it and let it sit for 24 hours and then put on another piece of tape on top of that, just to be sure. One positive thing compared to the front rim is that there's no air channel that can leak into this particular nipple here. So I know the problem is located right there, which makes it easier to deal with. So after 24 hours, the silicone has now set. And a little bit of cleaning before adding a second layer of tape. Now, I could have just covered the spoke that was leaking, but since I had some tape left, I might as well use it and just cover the rest as well. And back to the tire shop again. So now with the new tire mounted again, I made a second water test, and this time around, thankfully, there was no leak. Here we can see the difference in between the two Pirelli Scorpion Rally tire, where the STR one to the left has wider blocks and also narrower gaps in between the blocks. So finally it's time to refit the wheel, and we start by making sure that the rear axle is nice and clean before we put on some axle grease onto it. And you can be quite liberal with this. You want to make sure the whole axle is covered. Then we roll the rear wheel back into position, and we start by fitting the brake, which is made easier by separating the brake pads with a flat end screwdriver. Then you lift the wheel with one hand and you slide the rear axle through with your other. Make sure you clean out any excess axle grease, especially on the right hand side, because you don't want to have any grease flinged onto the brake disc. Put the chain back on, And then you put some non-seize grease on the treads before fitting the locking nut. And then tighten it only with 10 Newton meters. And that's to allow adjustment of the chain tension. And this model is supposed to be 50 millimeters slack at the midsection when the bike is resting on its side stand. So before you put it down on the side stand, you're trying to figure out where the chain is at its tightest. It's easier to work with the chain and the axle while on the paddock stand, but I guess Ducati reckon that you should be able to do this on the fly in the desert. You check the chain slack halfway in between the front and the rear axle, and that happens to be just below the lower bolt of the rear shock. You push the chain down with your finger. Then you use something simple to mark the lower position of the chain compared to the swing arm. Here I just used a piece of cardboard, and once I marked the lower end, I measured 50 millimeters and made another mark at the top end. And this made it quite easy to gauge the slack. You tighten the chain by turning these adjustment screws on both sides, and you use these markers to align it perfectly so it's exactly the same on both sides. Once you sorted out the chain tension, it's time to tighten the axle nut. Set your torque wrench to the correct setting, which in this case is 145 Newton meters. The last thing you do is to pump the brake a couple of times to get the pads back in the correct position before taking off. So let's see how much weight we saved with this hack. 1.2 kilos have been removed from the rear wheel, but in all fairness we also have to calculate with what we have added, including the silicone and the tape. And I've also added a tubeless valve. So with the silicone, the tape, the air valve, minus the inner tube and band, that equals a 1 kilo lighter rear wheel. And that's rotating and unsprung mass we're talking about. Not bad! So just a final disclaimer regarding the things that I do to my bikes. I never claim that these modifications will make the bike better. It's just me like tinkering around and testing things out, and I like the look better because with my modifications it looks taller, although it isn't. Does it make the bike better? Maybe not, but it is lighter. So what remains now is to test it thoroughly in the goblin-riddled outbacks of the dark Swedenland. And I'll let you know how it works out.
Underbart! Vad jävlar nu då?